The idea should have been a disaster. Take the quiet, disciplined world of Ralph Macchio's Miyagi-Do karate, built in the cultural shadow of 1984, and force it into the kinetic, physical universe of Jackie Chan's Kung Fu, born from an entirely different cinematic language. On paper, these traditions should collide rather than connect. One is rooted in patience, balance, memory, and the wisdom of a teacher who turns ordinary movements into lessons. The other carries the rhythm of improvisation, movement, comedy, pain, and survival. Add the weight of a beloved original franchise and the expectations surrounding a 2010 reboot, and the risk becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because nostalgia is dangerous. The moment Daniel LaRusso steps onto a familiar training ground, audiences are not simply remembering a karate movie. They are remembering an era, a character, a mentor, and an entire philosophy of growing up. The crane kick became more than a fighting technique because it represented the instant when an underestimated teenager finally discovered that confidence could be earned. Then 2010 arrives, shifts the story thousands of miles away to Beijing, replaces karate with kung fu, and puts Jackie Chan in the position once occupied by the legendary Mr. Miyagi. That is where the impossible crossover begins. The visual language alone tells us that we are entering a different world. The famous crane kick is controlled, almost ceremonial, its power coming from stillness before the strike. Jackie Chan's training scenes operate differently. A jacket comes on. A jacket comes off. Again. And again. What looks ridiculous at first slowly becomes exhausting, then purposeful. The body learns through repetition before the mind understands why. One image represents the birth of a martial artist through balance. The other represents discipline hidden inside an apparently meaningless routine. And yet, beneath those differences, something unexpectedly familiar begins to emerge. Li Fang is not simply another bullied kid waiting to become the toughest person in the room. His story carries a wound that cannot be solved by winning a tournament. After being displaced from his former life and forced to rebuild himself in New York, Li is carrying more than fear of confrontation. He is carrying grief, family trauma, and the disorienting feeling of being somewhere that does not yet feel like home. That changes the question. Instead of asking whether a weak kid can learn to fight, the story quietly asks whether fighting can help someone recover a sense of identity after losing part of himself. The punches matter, but they are not the real transformation. The real battle is internal, learning how to live with anger, guilt, memory, and the absence of someone who should still be there. That is why the crossover works when it easily could have failed. Miyagi-Do and Jackie Chan's Kung Fu do not need to become identical. They need to reveal that beneath different movements, different countries, and different cinematic traditions, both understand the same fundamental truth. Martial arts are not really about teaching someone how to hurt another person. They are about teaching someone what to do with the pain they already carry. To understand why this film matters, we have to look beyond the obvious question of whether it successfully continues the Karate Kid legacy. The more interesting question is what happens when Hollywood tries to make one story carry several generations of memories at once. The original 1984 film created a cultural blueprint around Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi. The 2010 film attempted something riskier: preserve the emotional DNA of that story while rebuilding its world through new characters, a new location, and a different martial arts tradition. That makes this installment worth examining from several angles. We will first break down the story itself, following Li Fang's journey from displacement and grief toward discipline and self-confidence. But the real focus will be on what exists underneath that progression, the relationship between the young student and the two very different masters guiding him. Their methods may appear incompatible, yet together they create a fascinating argument about what martial arts are actually supposed to teach. That argument becomes even clearer when we compare the physical languages of wushu and karate. One emphasizes fluidity, movement, and adaptability. The other is often associated with structure, control, timing, and disciplined technique. The film does not simply use those differences to make the fights look spectacular. They become part of Li's emotional education. His body has to learn a new way of moving at the same time his mind is learning a new way of processing anger and grief. And that is where the fight choreography becomes more revealing. Every stance, impact, pause, and recovery can tell us something about the character beneath the movement. The same applies to the sound design. The rhythm of footsteps, strikes, breathing, silence, and music can transform a fight from physical spectacle into emotional storytelling. When those elements work together, the action becomes less about who is stronger and more about what the character is fighting to overcome. There is also a larger Hollywood story hiding behind all of this. After the conclusion of Cobra Kai, the future of the Karate Kid universe is no longer simply about preserving nostalgia. It is about proving that these characters, philosophies, and conflicts can continue evolving without becoming prisoners of the past. This film sits directly inside that challenge. Because if the franchise can connect the lessons of 1984, the martial arts world of 2010, and a new generation shaped by entirely different emotional pressures, then it reveals something important about modern franchise filmmaking. The future does not necessarily belong to stories that forget their history. It belongs to stories that understand why that history mattered in the first place. For many viewers, The Karate Kid is not just a movie franchise. It is a timeline of growing up. Maybe your first memory is Daniel LaRusso standing across from an opponent beneath bright tournament lights, waiting for the moment when the underdog finally refuses to back down. Maybe it is Mr. Miyagi catching flies with chopsticks, an image so strange and memorable that it became inseparable from the character himself. Or maybe your connection came much later, through Cobra Kai, when suddenly the old rivalry between Miyagi-Do and Cobra Kai was no longer something preserved on an old VHS tape. It was alive again. And that is what makes this universe so unusual. Different generations have entered it through different doors. One generation grew up with the original films. Another discovered the story through the 2010 movie, watching Jackie Chan transform ordinary training into something that felt almost magical. Then came Cobra Kai, giving longtime fans a chance to binge-watch characters they had not seen in decades while introducing the conflict to an entirely new audience. Somewhere along the way, the question stopped being simply, who would win? It became, which philosophy would you choose? Would you follow Miyagi-Do, with its emphasis on balance, patience, defense, and inner control? Would you identify with Cobra Kai's aggressive philosophy of striking first and refusing to show weakness? Or would you find yourself somewhere between them, realizing that growing up often means discovering that neither extreme can explain everything? That emotional connection becomes even stronger through Li Fang, because his experience is recognizable even if his circumstances are not. Moving to a new city can make familiar streets feel foreign. A new school can make someone feel invisible. Family expectations can become another kind of pressure, especially when grief makes it difficult to explain what is happening inside your own head. That feeling of being the outsider is universal. And this is where Legends becomes more interesting than a simple continuation of a familiar formula. Beneath the fights and recognizable names are details that reward viewers who pay attention. Visual echoes, character parallels, training references, and small callbacks can change the way familiar moments feel when you recognize what the filmmakers are quietly connecting. For casual viewers, they may pass in seconds. For longtime fans, they can feel like pieces of a conversation stretching across decades. Because watching this universe evolve is strangely similar to watching ourselves evolve. The characters we once saw as heroes become complicated adults. The lessons we once understood as simple become more difficult with age. And the movies we remember from childhood suddenly contain meanings we were too young to notice. That is the real nostalgia here. Not simply remembering the past, but realizing that we have been carrying parts of it with us all along. The story of this new chapter begins long before the first punch is thrown, with a problem that has followed the Karate Kid franchise for more than a decade. How do you continue a story that already belongs to several generations without simply repeating it? The 2010 film had successfully introduced a new generation to the basic mythology through Dre Parker and Mr. Han, but its ending also created an obvious question. Where could the franchise possibly go after that? The earliest ideas for a follow-up were shaped around the world established by the 2010 film, with Jaden Smith remaining central to the conversation. Development went through different creative directions and rewrites, reflecting how difficult it was to determine whether the next movie should simply continue Dre's story or expand the mythology beyond one protagonist. Breck Eisner was among the filmmakers connected to the project during its long development period, illustrating just how many versions of the future were considered before the eventual film took shape. There was another complication. Jackie Chan was not simply another returning star. His presence carried expectations about the physical credibility of the martial arts material. A sequel involving Mr. Han could not treat the action as decorative background. Chan's standards for choreography, movement, and character motivation meant that the fighting had to feel connected to the emotional story rather than inserted merely because audiences expected spectacular action. That distinction matters because the Karate Kid has always used martial arts as storytelling language. The training is never just preparation for a tournament. It is how characters learn patience, confidence, restraint, and self-respect. Any continuation therefore had to solve two problems at once: create convincing action while giving that action a reason to exist. Then something happened that changed the franchise's position completely. Cobra Kai arrived and proved that audiences had not simply remembered the Karate Kid. They still cared about it. The series transformed characters who might once have seemed locked inside 1980s nostalgia into people capable of carrying contemporary drama. Old rivalries became complicated relationships. Former villains received perspectives of their own. New teenagers inherited conflicts they had never created. Its global popularity demonstrated something Hollywood had been waiting to discover: the Karate Kid was not merely a property that could be revived. It was a universe capable of expanding. That success changed the creative possibilities surrounding the next film. Instead of treating every installment as an isolated remake or sequel, the franchise could begin thinking in terms of generations, philosophies, and interconnected histories. That is where Jonathan Entwistle entered the picture. Known for work that combined teenage psychology with darker emotional material, Entwistle brought a different sensibility to a property historically associated with coming-of-age adventure. His experience with I Am Not Okay With This suggested an ability to find vulnerability beneath heightened genre situations, an important quality for a story centered on a young person carrying grief while attempting to rebuild his identity. With Rob Lieber handling the screenplay, the project could move towards something more ambitious than simply recreating the structure of an earlier Karate Kid movie. The goal became to make the old and new worlds coexist naturally. And that meant geography became part of the concept. Beijing represented the martial arts legacy associated with Mr. Han and the 2010 film. Reseda represented the original Southern California mythology of Daniel LaRusso, Mr. Miyagi, and the roots of Miyagi-Do. But instead of simply sending one character back to those locations, the new story could bring those histories into New York City. That choice is more significant than it initially appears. New York becomes neutral territory, a place where two cinematic traditions can meet without either one completely dominating the other. The old world arrives carrying memories of Reseda. The newer martial arts tradition arrives carrying the physical language of Beijing. Li Fang stands between them, not as a convenient bridge for the audience, but as someone whose own displacement mirrors the franchise's displacement. The result is a production concept built around collision, old and new, karate and kung fu, nostalgia and reinvention, grief and growth. The challenge was no longer simply making another Karate Kid movie. It was finding a way to make 4 decades of history feel like part of the same story without making the past do all the work. By the time Karate Kid Legends was preparing to reach theaters, the audience was no longer approaching the franchise with simple curiosity. It was approaching with memory. More than 40 years of history had accumulated around the Karate Kid name, and the final season of Cobra Kai had just reminded millions of viewers why Daniel LaRusso and this world still mattered. That created an unusual pre-release challenge. Sony was not introducing a completely new martial arts movie. It was asking several generations of fans to believe that an old story could still surprise them. The casting search became a clear signal that this would not simply be another nostalgia exercise. Sony launched a worldwide search for the new Karate Kid, looking for a young performer who could carry the emotional weight of the story while also handling demanding martial arts material. Thousands of actors were considered, and the search eventually led to Ben Wong, whose background, Mandarin fluency, screen presence, and martial arts ability made him unusually suited to the role of Li Fang. On one side was Jackie Chan, whose Mr. Han had carried the 2010 film and whose physical style had become inseparable from the franchise's modern identity. On the other was Ralph Macchio, returning as Daniel LaRusso, the character who had defined the original mythology in 1984. Bringing them together was therefore more than a casting announcement. It was the central marketing idea. The campaign leaned into the historic first meeting of these two screen legends. The imagery practically sold the premise by itself, Jackie Chan and Ralph Macchio, standing in the same Karate Kid story, preparing a new generation of fighter. For younger viewers, it created a simple question: what happens when two masters from completely different branches of the franchise finally share the same student? But the excitement came with skepticism. Cobra Kai had complicated the franchise's timeline so thoroughly that fans had become attentive to continuity. The series had spent years expanding Daniel's history, rebuilding old rivalries, introducing new students, and treating the original films as living parts of its narrative. So when Legends arrived after the show's conclusion, online discussions immediately questioned where it belonged. Was this a direct continuation? Did it overwrite anything? How could the 2010 movie fit alongside the original films and Cobra Kai? And if Daniel was already surrounded by generations of students, what made another young martial artist necessary? The danger was that the film could become a museum piece, expecting recognition to substitute for emotion. Jackie Chan and Ralph Macchio could share a frame, but that alone would not create a meaningful story. The new protagonist had to matter independently of them. Lee needed to be more than the teenager standing between two famous masters. That became especially important because the film was positioned as both an action spectacle and a family drama. With an estimated production budget of around $45 million, the movie had enough resources to deliver polished fight choreography and large-scale cinematic presentation, but its emotional engine remained intimate. Lee's displacement, his relationship with his mother, and the grief surrounding his family give the martial arts conflict a personal foundation. Sony's own synopsis framed him as a kung fu prodigy uprooted from Beijing and struggling to fit into a life in New York, making the emotional journey inseparable from the action. The marketing therefore had to perform a delicate balancing act. It could not pretend the past did not exist, because the reunion was the film's biggest immediate attraction. But it also could not let the reunion become the entire movie. The campaign needed viewers to understand that Macchio and Chan were not returning merely to repeat old victories. They were appearing as mentors whose combined histories would shape someone who had no connection to their original rivalry. In that sense, the promotional strategy was already teaching audiences how to watch the film, recognize the legacy, then look for the new story inside it. And that was the real pre-release gamble. The film was selling familiarity and uncertainty at the same time. Jackie Chan promised the memory of 2010. Ralph Macchio promised the memory of 1984. Cobra Kai had created a bridge between generations. Ben Wong represented the unknown. New York provided the meeting ground. And the central promise was that these pieces would not simply coexist, but change one another. For audiences who had followed the franchise for decades, that promise created anticipation even now. For skeptics, it created a test. The question was no longer whether Sony could make people recognize the Karate Kid. Everyone already did. The question was whether those familiar symbols could still generate genuine emotion when placed in a completely new generation's hands. The film begins in Beijing, but emotionally, Li Fang is already living somewhere else. He is trapped between the life he has and the life he lost, and the difference becomes clear through the way he moves. Li is already highly skilled in kung fu, training under Mr. Han with the confidence and instinct of someone who understands martial arts almost naturally. Yet his ability is complicated by the one rule that matters most at home: he is not supposed to fight. That contradiction defines him from the beginning. Mr. Han can see Li's talent, but he also understands the danger beneath it. Li does not approach martial arts simply as a sport or a discipline. There is anger inside his movements, a need to prove something that he cannot fully explain. His training therefore carries a strange tension. Every technique demonstrates control, while the person performing it is struggling to control himself. The reason is Bo Fong. Li's older brother died after becoming involved in a street fight, leaving behind a wound that has never properly closed. To Li, Bo is not simply a tragic memory. He is a constant presence in the family, an absence that shapes every decision. His death has transformed fighting from something that might have once been exciting into something terrifying for Dr. Fong. Her response is absolute. Lee must stay away from fighting. The rule makes emotional sense even when it becomes frustrating. From Dr. Fong's perspective, martial arts are no longer an innocent activity. She has already seen where violence can lead. Her fear is not theoretical. She has buried one son, and the possibility of losing another has become unbearable. For Lee, however, the prohibition creates another kind of isolation. The thing he is naturally good at is also the thing his mother fears most. He cannot simply explain that training helps him feel stronger or more balanced, because the family history has made those words almost meaningless. Every time Lee practices, he is moving towards something his mother wants him to leave behind. Then the decision is made that changes everything. Dr. Fong relocates with Lee to New York, hoping that a new environment will help them escape the memories surrounding Bo. From her perspective, the move is protection. For Lee, it feels more like another loss. Beijing is not just a city he is leaving. It is the place where his identity, his training, his brother, and his relationship with Mr. Han all exist. Suddenly, he is dropped into a completely different world. New York is louder, faster, more crowded, and less familiar. The film uses that contrast to reinforce Lee's emotional displacement. He is not merely a teenager adapting to a new school. He is someone trying to construct a new identity while carrying an old one that he has been told to suppress. The 5 boroughs become part of that fish-out-of-water experience. The rhythm of the city is different from Beijing, and Lee initially has no clear place within it. Even ordinary interactions can feel like tests of belonging. He has left behind the environment where he knew exactly who he was, only to enter one where that certainty no longer exists. Then he meets Mia Lipany. Their connection gives the New York portion of the story an immediate human center. Mia is not introduced simply as a romantic interest or convenient friend. Through her, Lee discovers a doorway into the new world he has been forced to enter. That doorway leads to Victory Pizza, where Mia's father, Victor, becomes another important part of Lee's new surroundings. Victor's presence adds another layer to the story because the pizza shop represents something Lee has lost: familiarity built through family and community. It is a local space where people know one another, where work and personal history overlap, and where identity is tied to something tangible. For Lee, that environment is both comforting and uncomfortable. He has arrived in New York trying to escape the past, yet almost immediately he begins forming new relationships that could eventually force him to confront it. Mia offers friendship and possibility. Victor introduces another version of family responsibility. Dr. Fong remains determined to protect him from violence. And somewhere beneath all of it, Bo's memory continues shaping every choice. The film therefore establishes its central conflict before Lee ever needs to prove himself in a major fight. His greatest obstacle is not an opponent standing across a mat. It is the belief that surviving means becoming someone who never looks back. And that is precisely what makes his martial arts ability so complicated. Lee already knows how to fight. What he does not yet know is what his strength is supposed to mean. New York begins to feel less foreign once Lee has someone to share it with. His scooter rides through the city become small moments of freedom, carrying him through streets that initially seemed overwhelming. With Mia beside him, the unfamiliar landscape starts becoming personal. Their growing connection gives Lee something he has not had since leaving Beijing: the possibility of building a life that is not entirely defined by what happened before. But that fragile sense of normality does not last. The disruption comes through Connor Day, a local martial arts champion whose confidence quickly reveals itself as something darker. Connor is not simply talented. He has learned to treat superiority as a weapon. His training under Coach O'Shea has reinforced the idea that dominance is more valuable than restraint, turning competition into intimidation and making the people around him feel like obstacles rather than human beings. For Lee, this creates an immediate problem. He has been ordered by his mother not to fight. The command follows him everywhere, even when doing nothing becomes its own kind of punishment. Lee tries to stay quiet. He tries to avoid confrontation. He understands exactly why Dr. Fong is afraid of violence, and part of him genuinely wants to respect that fear. But Connor does not make that easy. The harassment is physical and verbal, gradually stripping away the illusion that Lee can simply remain invisible. The more Lee attempts to withdraw, the more obvious it becomes that avoiding violence is not always the same thing as avoiding conflict. Sometimes another person decides that conflict exists whether you want it to or not. That distinction is crucial to Lee's character. He is not looking for an excuse to fight. In fact, his resistance comes from knowing exactly what fighting has already cost his family. Bo's death has turned every confrontation into a reminder of consequences. When Lee feels anger rising, there is another voice inside him telling him that acting on it could make him another version of the brother he lost. So he holds back. That restraint initially looks like weakness to people around him. In a culture where confidence is often measured by how quickly someone responds to disrespect, refusing to retaliate can make Lee appear powerless. But the audience understands something his antagonists do not. He is fighting an internal battle every time he chooses not to use the skills he possesses. His problem is not that he cannot fight. His problem is that he does not yet know when fighting is justified. That question becomes unavoidable when the pressure finally reaches a breaking point. Lee uses his martial arts training in self-defense, and the decision changes how other people see him. The hidden talent he has been trying to suppress is suddenly visible. More importantly, it attracts the attention of Mr. Han. Han recognizes the difference between someone who enjoys violence and someone who has been pushed into it. He sees Lee's technique, but he also sees the emotional instability beneath it. The young fighter is capable, but his ability is connected to pain, fear, and unresolved grief. And then another unexpected observer enters the equation. Daniel LaRusso. His arrival carries a weight that Lee cannot fully understand yet. Daniel is not simply another martial arts teacher. He represents an entire history of the Karate Kid, a philosophy built through his relationship with Mr. Miyagi and shaped by decades of experience. His presence creates the possibility that Lee's journey will no longer belong exclusively to the world of Kung Fu. This is where the film's central martial arts collision begins to take shape. Mr. Han understands Lee through the language of movement he already knows. Daniel understands him through a different tradition, one built around balance, defense, patience, and discipline. Neither man needs to erase the other's philosophy. Instead, Lee becomes the unusual student capable of standing between them. That possibility also changes the meaning of his conflict with Connor. What began as a local rivalry is now connected to something larger. Lee's choice to defend himself has opened a door he cannot easily close. He has crossed the threshold not because he suddenly wants to become a fighter, but because circumstances have forced him to confront the one part of himself he has been running from. And beneath that decision is the memory of Bo, still quietly shaping the question that matters most. If strength can destroy, can it also become a way to heal? The moment Mr. Han and Daniel LaRusso finally stand in the same space carries the weight of a meeting that fans have imagined for years. Yet the scene becomes more interesting because the two men do not immediately feel like partners. They arrive carrying completely different memories of what martial arts are supposed to accomplish. Han has already learned that technique means adaptation. His kung fu is fluid, responsive, and built around reading another person's movement rather than forcing every situation into a fixed pattern. Daniel's Miyagi-Do comes from another tradition. Its foundation is defense, balance, patience, and the ability to absorb pressure without allowing anger to control the response. Neither philosophy needs to be declared superior. That is precisely why their first interaction works. Han looks at Daniel and sees a fighter whose instincts have been shaped by decades of experience. Daniel looks at Han and sees someone whose methods may be unfamiliar but whose understanding of discipline feels strangely recognizable. Their differences create friction, but underneath that friction is mutual respect. For Lee, the meeting is more than a spectacular collision of franchise history. It creates a new problem. Until this point, he has been trying to understand himself through one martial arts language. Now two masters are offering him different ways to interpret the same instinct. Daniel's lessons emphasize protection. The defensive movements of Miyagi-Do are not presented as passivity. Blocking, shifting position, and redirecting an attack require the student to remain calm enough to recognize where the opponent's energy is going. Han approaches movement from a more fluid kung fu perspective, where adaptation and continuous motion allow the fighter to respond instead of simply waiting for a perfect opening. The distinction sounds technical, but for Lee it becomes psychological. He is a teenager who has spent years reacting to grief. His anger pushes forward while his fear tells him to retreat. Between Han and Daniel, he begins learning that strength does not have to mean choosing one extreme. Sometimes strength is knowing when to move. Sometimes it is knowing when not to. The training montages turn that idea into physical language. Lee moves through rooftops, parks, and ordinary corners of New York while learning from two masters whose approaches constantly challenge his instincts. The city itself becomes part of the training ground. Instead of the secluded locations associated with earlier stories, practice happens within a crowded urban environment, suggesting that discipline is no longer something that exists away from everyday life. It has to survive inside it. Han watches Lee's body. Daniel watches his reactions. Together, they begin exposing weaknesses that Lee could never recognize alone. A technique can be powerful and still be emotionally useless if the person performing it is consumed by anger. A defensive stance can protect the body while leaving the mind trapped in fear. Training therefore becomes less about collecting moves and more about changing the meaning behind those moves. But the outside world is becoming more dangerous. Connor's conflict with Lee is no longer an isolated school rivalry. His connection to O'Shea gives the pressure a larger financial and personal dimension, particularly as Victor Lipini's pizza shop becomes a target. The restaurant represents Victor's livelihood and a piece of stability for Mia, which means threatening it creates consequences far beyond a martial arts competition. This is important because Lee's motivation begins changing. At first, he wanted to avoid trouble because he feared what fighting could awaken inside him. Now the people he cares about are being pulled into the conflict. Walking away may no longer protect anyone. His mother's warning still hangs over him, but the meaning of self-defense is becoming harder to define. The stakes are therefore rising on two levels at once. Outside Lee, Connor and O'Shea are tightening the pressure. Inside him, the competing lessons of Han and Daniel are forcing him to rethink what strength actually means. The student who once wanted nothing more than to stay out of a fight is slowly discovering that the real challenge is not learning how to strike. It is learning what he is willing to stand up for. And this is where the dual master idea becomes more than a novelty. Han and Daniel are not competing to replace one another. Their value comes from the fact that each sees a different part of Lee. Han understands the boy's grief and the dangerous emotions hidden inside his technique. Daniel understands the discipline required to turn those emotions into something constructive. The film uses their contrast to suggest that mastery is not a single road. Sometimes the most important lesson arrives when two traditions stop arguing over which one is right and begin asking what the student actually needs. The fragile balance Lee has built begins collapsing the moment his secret training can no longer remain secret. After the violent ambush leaves him injured, he returns home carrying physical evidence of everything his mother has been trying to prevent. Ice packs, frozen peas, bruises, and the exhausted look on his face tell Dr. Fong what Lee has refused to say. He has been fighting again. For Lee, the discovery is humiliating. For his mother, it is terrifying. Her reaction is not simply anger over disobedience. The sight of her son injured reopens a wound she has spent years trying to keep closed. Every bruise reminds her of Bo. Every attempt Lee makes to explain himself sounds, to her, like the beginning of the same tragedy happening again. That is why the argument becomes much larger than whether Lee should enter a competition. Dr. Fong finally reveals the fear underneath her strict rules. Bo's death was not an abstract accident that happened somewhere in the past. It was connected to violence, and the memory has shaped the entire family's understanding of danger. Losing Bo convinced her that fighting does not lead to strength. It leads to consequences that cannot be undone. Lee has interpreted her rules as a refusal to understand him. She has been living them as a desperate attempt to keep her remaining son alive. That difference changes the emotional meaning of everything that came before. Lee thought he was being forced to abandon the one thing he was good at. Dr. Fong believed she was asking him to abandon the one thing that could destroy him. Neither side is completely wrong, and that is what makes the conflict painful. Lee's secret training is exposed at precisely the moment when his confidence is already beginning to fracture. He has been learning from Han and Daniel, but the attacks and pressure surrounding Victor's shop have made it increasingly difficult to believe that skill alone can solve anything. Now his mother has forbidden him from competing, removing the goal that had given his training direction. The timing could hardly be worse. Victor's pizza shop is also under threat from O'Shea. What began as intimidation has developed into a serious threat to Victor's livelihood and Mia's family. Lee can see the damage being done, yet the person he wants to protect most at home is telling him that stepping into the conflict is exactly what he must not do. He is trapped between responsibility and fear. This becomes Lee's lowest point because both choices feel like betrayal. If he fights, he risks betraying his mother's trust. If he refuses to fight, he feels as though he is abandoning Mia and Victor. The confidence he had begun building through training starts to disappear because he no longer knows which version of himself he is supposed to become. And beneath that confusion is Bo. Lee has spent much of the story carrying grief without fully understanding its shape. Now the truth about Bo's death forces him to confront what that grief has been doing to him. His fear of violence is not only inherited from his mother. Part of Lee has been afraid that anger could turn him into someone capable of repeating the same destructive pattern. That realization changes the meaning of martial arts. Han and Daniel understand that simply telling Lee to fight harder would miss the point. The real lesson has to reach Dr. Fong as well. They help her see that there is a difference between fighting because of anger and fighting because someone needs protection. Avoiding every confrontation cannot guarantee safety. Sometimes refusing to prepare for danger leaves a person more vulnerable, not less. For Dr. Fong, this is an agonizing idea because accepting it means admitting that protection cannot always take the form of keeping Lee away from the world. She cannot erase what happened to Bo. She cannot control every person who might hurt her son. What she can do is help Lee develop the judgment to respond differently. That becomes the emotional turning point. Han brings the understanding of Lee's grief. Daniel brings the philosophy of disciplined defense. Together, they give Dr. Fong another way to look at the martial arts her son has been secretly practicing. The goal is no longer to make Lee fearless. It is to teach him that courage can exist alongside fear. And for Lee, that distinction is everything. He does not need to forget Bo in order to move forward. He does not need to become someone who enjoys fighting. He needs to understand that strength can be used without surrendering to anger. For the first time, the family begins moving toward the same lesson. Running from fear has protected Lee from some dangers, but it has also kept him trapped inside the memory of the one danger his family could never escape. Facing it will not bring Bo back. But it may finally allow Lee to stop living as though his brother's death is waiting to happen again. GY from the earlier training sequences. The elimination rounds introduce fighters with different approaches, creating a miniature portrait of martial arts as a world rather than a single technique. Each opponent forces Lee to adjust. Speed demands timing. Power demands positioning. Unpredictable attacks require awareness rather than memorized responses. That variety matters because Lee is no longer fighting with only one philosophy. His training with Mr. Han taught him to redirect energy instead of meeting force with force. Han's approach encourages movement, adaptability, and the ability to turn an opponent's aggression against itself. Daniel LaRusso has given Lee another layer, the defensive principles of Miyagi-Do, where patience and balance create opportunities for precise counters. Earlier in the story, these ideas could seem like separate systems. Here, they become one language. Lee begins moving differently because he is thinking differently. Instead of automatically reacting to an attack, he reads the movement first. Instead of trying to overpower an opponent, he allows momentum to create openings. The influence of Kung Fu appears in his fluid movement, while Miyagi-Do emerges in the timing of his defensive responses and counterstrikes. This is the payoff of the dual master concept. The film does not need Lee to declare that one tradition is superior. His body becomes the argument. He can absorb lessons from both without losing his own identity. The student is no longer simply copying his teachers. He is synthesizing what they gave him into something personal. But reaching Connor is not easy. The championship fight carries the emotional weight of every confrontation that came before it. Connor is not simply a technically capable opponent. He represents the mentality Lee has been trying to reject: intimidation, domination, and the belief that victory justifies cruelty. His psychological tactics are designed to destabilize Lee before the physical contest can even be decided. The most dangerous part of Connor's approach is that he understands Lee's vulnerability. He knows the young fighter has been carrying grief. He knows that fear and anger are connected inside him. Provocation becomes another weapon, designed to make Lee lose the calm he has spent months developing. The dirty moves and brutal tactics push the contest away from the clean image of a sporting competition and back toward the uncontrolled violence that Lee's mother has always feared. This is where the climax becomes psychological. The old Lee might have answered humiliation with anger. He might have allowed Connor's aggression to determine the rhythm of the fight. But the person standing in the tournament now has learned that control is not the same thing as weakness. Lee does not need to become more violent than Connor. He needs to remain himself. That is why the hybrid style becomes so important during the championship match. Han's lessons allow Lee to redirect the force coming toward him, while Daniel's teachings help him recognize the moment when a defensive movement should become a counter. Instead of treating Kung Fu and Karate as competing identities, Lee turns them into complementary tools. The choreography therefore becomes a visual representation of his emotional growth. At the beginning of the story, Lee's movements were connected to unresolved pain. By the climax, his movements are connected to choice. He decides when to move, when to defend, and when to strike. The difference is subtle but fundamental. He is no longer fighting because anger has taken control of him. He is fighting because he has chosen what deserves protection. That distinction allows him to withstand Connor's psychological pressure. The victory, therefore, is not simply about defeating the strongest opponent in the tournament. It is about refusing to become the kind of person Connor expects him to be. And when Lee finally prevails, the emotional victory extends beyond the tournament floor. Victor's Pizza Shop is no longer merely a location where Lee met Mia. It has become a symbol of the new life he was building in New York. Protecting it means protecting the people who welcomed him when he felt displaced. The tournament's outcome therefore carries consequences beyond personal pride. It helps secure the future of a family and community that Lee has gradually begun to consider his own. But the most meaningful resolution belongs to Dr. Fong. For most of the story, her fear has been positioned against Lee's desire to fight. She believed that keeping him away from martial arts was the only way to keep him safe. Lee, meanwhile, saw her rule as evidence that she did not trust the person he was becoming. The tournament allows both of them to see the truth from the other's perspective. Lee has not forgotten Bo. He has not transformed grief into aggression. He has learned to carry his brother's memory without allowing that memory to dictate every decision he makes. And Dr. Fong finally sees that distinction. Her approval matters because Lee's victory would feel incomplete without it. Winning a trophy cannot erase the pain of losing Bo, but earning his mother's trust gives Lee something more valuable than a championship title: permission to move forward without feeling guilty for surviving. That is what makes the final resolution emotionally satisfying. Lee does not defeat his past by forgetting it. He honors Bo by refusing to let tragedy define the rest of his life. The tournament ends with a champion, but the deeper victory belongs to the family surrounding him. Han's Kung Fu, Daniel's Miyagi-Do, Mia's friendship, Victor's resilience, and Dr. Fong's eventual acceptance all become pieces of Lee's transformation. The boy who arrived in New York believing he had lost his place has finally created a new one. And perhaps that is the most fitting evolution for the Karate Kid legacy. The lesson was never simply that the bullied kid can learn to fight back. It was that discipline can transform pain into purpose. Lee's greatest achievement is not proving that he can defeat Connor. It is proving that he can become strong without becoming consumed by the violence that once defined his family's greatest loss. Li Fong works because his greatest opponent is never standing across from him. On the surface, his story appears to follow a familiar martial arts structure. A talented young fighter enters a new environment, encounters an intimidating rival, trains under experienced masters, and eventually steps into a tournament. But underneath that recognizable framework is a much more personal struggle. Lee is not simply trying to become strong enough to win. He is trying to understand whether he deserves to move forward after surviving something his brother did not. His external goal is easy to identify. He wants to defend the people who have become important to him in New York, protect Victor and the pizza shop, stand up to Connor, and ultimately prove himself in competition. These objectives give the plot momentum. Every confrontation provides another reason for Lee to improve. His internal goal is much harder. Lee needs to forgive himself. The problem is that survivor's guilt rarely behaves logically. Even when someone understands intellectually that they were not responsible for another person's death, emotions can continue creating a different story. Bo's death has left Lee carrying questions that cannot be answered through physical training. Could he have done something differently? Could he have protected his brother? Is his own survival somehow connected to the loss? None of those questions need rational answers to affect the way he behaves. They simply become part of how he sees himself. That is why Lee's relationship with his mother is so complicated. Dr. Fong's fear makes him feel responsible for her anxiety, even though her trauma is not something he created. Every time she warns him about fighting, Lee hears more than a simple instruction. He hears the memory of Bo. He hears the possibility that his own actions could cause his mother another devastating loss. So Lee suppresses himself. This is one of the most important differences between Lee and the traditional underdog protagonist. He does not begin as someone who desperately wants to learn how to fight. He already possesses the skill. What he lacks is permission, both from his mother and from himself, to believe that his ability can exist without leading to tragedy. That creates a fascinating contradiction. His martial arts talent is a source of confidence, but it is also connected to guilt. The thing that could make him feel powerful is the same thing he has been taught to fear. Ben Wong's performance benefits from that contradiction because Lee's emotional development is often communicated physically. His agility makes the action convincing, but his performance is not built around athletic ability alone. Small changes in posture, hesitation, frustration, and facial expression allow the character to feel younger than the martial artist he is capable of becoming. That distinction is important. Lee can move like an experienced fighter while still emotionally behaving like someone who has not figured out where he belongs. The contrast creates vulnerability beneath the action. Even when he looks impressive in a fight, there is a sense that the person inside the technique is still searching for stability. Wong also brings an approachable charm that prevents Lee from becoming overly defined by trauma. He can be awkward, funny, curious, frustrated, and emotionally guarded without making those qualities feel like separate versions of the character. That gives the audience room to care about him outside the martial arts story. His relationship with Mia becomes especially important for that reason. Through her, Lee experiences New York as something other than displacement. He begins to discover that his new life can contain genuine happiness without erasing the old one. That is a subtle but important step in his healing. Because Lee's transformation is not about choosing between Beijing and New York. It is about accepting that both can belong to him. His identity is similarly larger than a single martial arts tradition. He carries the discipline of Kung Fu, learns from Miyagi-Do, adapts to an unfamiliar city, and develops relationships that were impossible in his previous life. Rather than treating those influences as contradictions, the story gradually turns them into parts of one identity. That becomes clearest in his relationship with Han and Daniel. Han connects with the emotional side of Lee's martial arts. He recognizes the anger and grief underneath the technique. Daniel offers another perspective, teaching Lee that defense can be an expression of strength rather than fear. Together, they help Lee understand that his abilities do not belong to his teachers. They are becoming his. That is the real transformation. At the beginning, Lee is a talented boy who wants to disappear. He hides his skills because he believes strength might lead him toward the same fate as his brother. By the end, he is willing to use those skills openly, but the reason has changed. He is no longer fighting to prove that he is not weak. He is fighting because he has learned what he wants to protect. That distinction separates confidence from aggression. Lee does not become powerful because he stops being afraid. He becomes powerful because fear no longer makes every decision for him. He can acknowledge grief without surrendering to it. He can respect his mother's pain without allowing that pain to determine his entire future. He can remember Bo without believing that moving forward means leaving his brother behind. And that is why the tournament matters less than the person Lee becomes before he enters it. The trophy can confirm that he is a capable martial artist. The deeper victory is emotional. Lee finally understands that surviving does not make him guilty, and becoming happy does not betray the person he lost. He does not have to carry his brother's death as a punishment. He can carry Bo as part of his history. That is what it means for Lee to own his legacy. Not replacing Daniel. Not replacing Han. Not choosing between karate and kung fu. And not becoming another version of someone who came before him. He becomes the first version of Lee Fong who is finally comfortable being himself. Connor Day represents the kind of opponent Lee could have become under different circumstances. At first glance, he appears to be a familiar martial arts antagonist, talented, aggressive, arrogant, and convinced that losing is unacceptable. But his function in the story becomes more interesting when his behavior is viewed as a distorted reflection of Lee's own insecurities. Connor is already successful. He has the athletic ability, the reputation, and the confidence that Lee initially lacks. Yet the intensity of his behavior suggests that winning is not enough to make him feel secure. His aggression feels less like confidence than compensation. Every victory has to prove something, and every challenge becomes a threat to his identity. That makes his relationship with status especially important. Connor has built his sense of worth around being the person nobody can defeat. The moment another fighter threatens that position, his confidence becomes unstable. He cannot simply accept that someone else might be better on a particular day because his entire identity depends on being superior. Losing would not just mean losing a match. To Connor, it would mean becoming irrelevant. That insecurity gives his rivalry with Lee a personal edge. Lee represents everything Connor does not understand. He is talented without seeking attention. He has entered the local martial arts world as an outsider. He does not initially care about Connor's reputation. That indifference itself becomes threatening because Connor cannot intimidate someone who does not yet recognize the hierarchy he is trying to enforce. The implication of family pressure also adds another layer to Connor's psychology. His need for approval and his fear of failure suggest a young person who has learned to measure his value through achievement. Instead of processing that insecurity, he converts it into aggression. If he can dominate another fighter, he does not have to confront the possibility that he might not be good enough. That is where Sensei O'Shea becomes so important. Connor may be the physical threat, but O'Shea is the ideological threat. A corrupt mentor can do more damage than an ordinary bully because he gives destructive behavior a framework that makes it feel justified. O'Shea's approach is built around winning at any cost, using power and intimidation to control people beyond the tournament floor. His financial pressure against Victor's community turns martial arts into something transactional. The discipline that should teach responsibility becomes another tool for exploitation. This creates an obvious connection to the darker traditions associated with Cobra Kai's history. John Kreese and Terry Silver represented philosophies in which strength was often separated from morality. Fear became a teaching method. Victory became proof of worth. Compassion became weakness. O'Shea belongs to that family of antagonists without simply becoming a copy of them. His environment gives the conflict a different texture. This is not a suburban dojo rivalry recreated from the 1980s. It exists inside New York, where the pressure surrounding Victor's business, money, reputation, and community creates a more grounded sense of danger. O'Shea's manipulation makes the martial arts conflict feel connected to real-world power rather than existing entirely inside a tournament. And that makes Connor more tragic. He is not operating in a vacuum. Someone has encouraged him to believe that cruelty is effective. O'Shea has taken Connor's insecurity and turned it into a weapon, reinforcing the idea that fear is the easiest path to control. Connor is therefore both aggressor and product. That does not excuse his behavior. But it explains why he is useful as Lee's mirror. Both boys experience anger. Both have reasons to feel displaced or threatened. Both understand what it means to be judged. The difference is how they respond. Lee initially suppresses his anger because he is terrified of what it might do. Connor embraces his anger because it gives him a sense of power. One boy runs from his aggression. The other hides inside it. That contrast becomes the psychological heart of their rivalry. Lee's journey teaches him that strength requires control. Connor's training teaches him that strength requires dominance. Lee learns to redirect energy rather than absorb it emotionally. Connor tries to overpower resistance. Lee gradually discovers that defending someone does not make him weak. Connor interprets defense as an invitation to attack harder. Their fighting styles therefore communicate character. When Connor uses intimidation, dirty tactics, or psychological pressure, the action becomes an extension of his insecurity. He wants Lee emotionally destabilized because he understands that controlling the opponent's mind can be as valuable as controlling the physical contest. But Lee eventually stops giving him that control. That is what makes their final confrontation more meaningful than a simple hero versus villain matchup. Lee is not only defeating Connor. He is rejecting the worldview that Connor represents. The question of whether Connor receives a genuine redemption beat is more complicated. The film gives him enough vulnerability to suggest that he is not simply a monster. His insecurity and dependence on O'Shea provide context for his behavior, leaving room to imagine a different future for him. But understanding the source of someone's cruelty is not the same as excusing it. Connor still has choices. He chooses intimidation. He chooses aggression. He chooses to participate in a system that hurts other people. That moral distinction matters because a forced redemption would weaken the story. Lee's victory does not require Connor to suddenly become a good person. What matters is that Connor's philosophy loses its power over Lee. O'Shea, meanwhile, represents the more dangerous version of the same ideology because he is old enough to understand exactly what he is doing. Connor may be searching for approval, but O'Shea exploits that need. He turns insecurity into profit and violence into leverage. The two antagonists therefore operate on different levels. Connor is the threat Lee can see. O'Shea is the system teaching that threat how to grow. And Lee's victory becomes meaningful because he refuses to inherit either model. He does not suppress his strength forever, but he also refuses to let anger become his identity. In that sense, Connor is not merely the villain Lee must defeat. He is the warning of what Lee might have become if grief had convinced him that hurting others was the only way to stop hurting himself. If Lee Fong is the emotional center of the story, the people around him determine whether his transformation feels believable. The film understands that a coming-of-age story cannot exist in isolation. Lee needs adults who challenge him, protect him, misunderstand him, and eventually trust him. He also needs peers who make his new life feel like something worth fighting for. That balance keeps the story from becoming another simple tournament movie. At the center of that adult world are Mr. Han and Daniel LaRusso. Their chemistry works because Jackie Chan and Ralph Macchio bring almost opposite energies to their characters. Han is quiet, restrained, and observant. His authority often comes from what he chooses not to say. There is a sense that he has already lived through enough pain to understand that not every lesson needs to be delivered through a speech. Daniel carries a different energy. His connection to Miyagi-Do is deeply personal. He is passionate about its principles because they are inseparable from the man who taught them to him. Where Han tends to observe before acting, Daniel can be more direct. Where Han's wisdom feels shaped by experience and loss, Daniel's confidence carries the emotional history of someone who has spent decades protecting a philosophy that changed his own life. That contrast makes the dual-sensei relationship valuable. They are not simply two famous characters placed together for nostalgia. They represent two different ways of teaching. Han understands Lee's internal pain, while Daniel helps translate discipline into a philosophy of defense and balance. Their differences create occasional friction, but their shared concern for Lee gradually becomes more important than their methods. There is also an important generational element to their relationship. Daniel once stood where Lee stands now, young, uncertain, and searching for guidance. But he is no longer the student. He has become the teacher. Seeing him interact with Han therefore gives the audience a glimpse of how the lessons of Mr. Miyagi have continued to evolve. Miyagi's influence is present without requiring him to physically dominate the story. That is essential. The film can honor the original legacy without pretending that Daniel has never changed since 1984. He carries the lessons forward, but he is now capable of passing them to someone whose life is completely different from his own. Dr. Fong provides another kind of mentorship, although she initially does not see herself that way. Ming Na Wen's character is driven by protection rather than martial arts philosophy. Her strict opposition to fighting can initially appear restrictive, especially from Li's perspective, but the emotional foundation of that fear is understandable. She has already experienced profound loss. Her medical background also reinforces the practical side of her thinking. She understands vulnerability, injury, and consequences in a way that makes her fear more grounded than simple parental overreaction. When she tells Li to stay away from fighting, she is not trying to prevent him from becoming confident. She is trying to prevent another tragedy from entering her family. That makes her eventual acceptance more meaningful. She does not suddenly stop being afraid. She begins trusting that Li can make responsible decisions despite the dangers she cannot control. The Lipany family provides a warmer contrast. Victor becomes one of the first people in New York to offer Li a sense of belonging. His background as an ex-boxer gives him an intuitive understanding of physical discipline, but his importance comes from what happens outside the ring. Victor's pizza shop becomes a community space where Li can experience ordinary life, friendship, and family connection. Joshua Jackson gives Victor a toughness that does not prevent him from being approachable. He can feel like the kind of adult who has been through enough setbacks to understand that pride is less important than protecting the people around him. Mia becomes central to that emotional bridge. Sadie Stanley's performance gives Li a relationship that is not built around martial arts. Their connection allows the film to breathe between confrontations and reminds us that Li is still a teenager trying to make friends, navigate attraction, and figure out where he belongs. Mia does not exist simply to motivate Li. She represents the possibility of a future that has nothing to do with the grief of his past. That distinction matters. Li needs reasons to fight, but he also needs reasons to live. Even the lighter characters and school dynamics serve a purpose. Comic relief, particularly through characters such as Alan, prevents the emotional weight from becoming overwhelming. The humor makes the world feel inhabited by actual teenagers rather than characters permanently trapped inside a dramatic martial arts movie. School life performs a similar function. Li is not only a fighter, student, grieving brother, or apprentice. He is also a kid dealing with ordinary social pressures. Those smaller moments keep the extraordinary elements grounded. A tournament matters more when the person entering it still has homework, friendships, embarrassment, and everyday problems waiting outside the arena. This is where the ensemble succeeds. The adults provide history, guidance, conflict, and protection, but they do not completely consume the narrative. Han and Daniel may carry decades of franchise mythology, Jackie Chan and Ralph Macchio may carry enormous nostalgic value, and Dr. Fong may carry the family's deepest emotional fear, but Li remains the person whose choices determine where the story goes. That balance is especially important for a legacy franchise. It would have been easy to turn the film into a parade of familiar faces. Instead, the supporting cast works best when its members illuminate different parts of Li's journey. Han teaches him how to understand pain. Daniel teaches him how to transform discipline into defense. Dr. Fong teaches him that love can sometimes look like fear. Victor gives him community. Mia gives him connection. Together, they create something the martial arts alone cannot provide. A home. And for a character whose story begins with being displaced from one, that may be the most important victory of all. At the center of the film is an idea that can be reduced to a simple image: two branches growing from one tree. Karate and Kung Fu may look different on the surface, with different movements, traditions, histories, and philosophies, but the film suggests that their deepest roots are remarkably similar. Both demand discipline. Both require respect. Both teach control. And both can give a person a way to transform emotional pain into something constructive. That is why the relationship between Miyagi-Do and Mr. Han's Kung Fu never needs to become a competition over which system is superior. The film is more interested in what happens when two traditions recognize something familiar in one another. Karate and Kung Fu become reflections of life itself. One can emphasize structure while the other emphasizes fluidity. One may teach a student to stand firm while the other teaches the value of adapting to movement. But both ultimately ask the same question: what happens when you are placed under pressure? Do you panic? Do you lash out? Or can you remain centered long enough to choose your response? For Lee, that lesson is inseparable from grief. His trauma is not presented as something that can be solved simply by talking about it once. It lives inside his body. His anger affects the way he moves. His fear changes the way he reacts. His memories of Bo influence how he understands violence. Training therefore becomes a physical method of processing emotions that Lee struggles to articulate. Every repetition gives him another opportunity to regain control. In that sense, movement becomes a language for grief. Lee cannot change what happened to his brother, but he can change what that memory does to him. Training gives structure to emotions that otherwise feel chaotic. Breathing, balance, repetition, and concentration create moments in which the past becomes quieter. The film does not suggest that martial arts magically cure trauma. Instead, it presents discipline as a way of learning how to live alongside pain without allowing pain to control every decision. That idea connects directly to Lee's experience as an immigrant. His relocation to New York is not simply a change of scenery. It creates a conflict between preserving where he came from and learning how to belong somewhere new. Lee carries Beijing with him through his language, memories, family history, and Kung Fu. But New York gradually gives him new friendships, new responsibilities, and new possibilities. The important point is that assimilation does not require erasure. Lee does not have to stop being connected to his heritage in order to become part of New York. His identity expands rather than being replaced. The combination of his existing Kung Fu knowledge with Miyagi-Do becomes a metaphor for that process. He can absorb something new without surrendering what came before. That makes the martial arts metaphor broader than the franchise itself. People often imagine identity as a choice between two places, two cultures, or two versions of themselves. The film suggests something more complicated. A person can belong to more than one world. Contradictory influences can coexist. New experiences do not necessarily destroy old ones. Sometimes they reveal possibilities that were impossible to see before. And that is why the New York setting matters. The struggles Lee encounters are specific to his circumstances, but the emotions are universal. Feeling like an outsider is universal. Wanting approval from a parent is universal. Being afraid that one mistake could change everything is universal. Losing someone and wondering how to continue living afterward is universal. The film takes those enormous human experiences and places them inside very local problems. A new school, a neighborhood business, a difficult rival, unfamiliar streets, and a family trying to rebuild itself. That specificity makes the emotions more believable. Lee may be learning kung fu and karate in New York, but the deeper conflict has nothing to do with geography. It is about learning how to carry the past without becoming trapped inside it. That is ultimately what 2 branches, 1 tree means. The branches can grow in different directions. They can encounter different climates, different traditions, and different challenges. They can look completely different from one another. But they can still share the same roots. For Lee, those roots are discipline, family, respect, resilience, and the desire to become stronger without becoming harder. The film's martial arts traditions are therefore not competing identities. They are different expressions of the same human search for balance. And once Lee understands that, the distinction between karate and kung fu becomes less important than the person they have helped him become. The visual language of Karate Kid, Legends quietly tells the same story as its characters. Long before Lee explains what he is feeling, the film places him inside environments that reflect his emotional state. Beijing and New York are not simply locations. They represent 2 parts of his identity, and the contrast between them gradually becomes less about choosing one world over another and more about learning how both can coexist. Beijing carries a warmer visual identity. Traditional reds and gold suggest history, family, ceremony, and the cultural world Lee understands instinctively. These colors give his early surroundings a sense of familiarity, even when the emotional atmosphere is complicated by Bo's absence. New York, by contrast, often feels cooler and harder. Blues, whites, concrete, metal, glass, subway infrastructure, and crowded streets create an industrial texture that reflects Lee's initial sense of displacement. The difference is almost emotional geography. Beijing feels like memory. New York feels like the present. Yet the film gradually begins blending those visual identities, especially as Lee becomes more comfortable in his new environment. The eventual martial arts arena becomes a meeting point between worlds, where the traditions he carries from Beijing and the lessons he has absorbed in New York can exist within the same frame. Water becomes another recurring visual idea. Its symbolism fits the film's emphasis on adaptation because water can move around obstacles without losing its essential nature. That mirrors the lesson Lee receives from his training. Strength does not always mean resisting pressure directly. Sometimes survival requires flexibility. The same principle appears in a surprisingly ordinary activity, kneading pizza dough. At first, preparing dough seems completely disconnected from martial arts. But the physical rhythm of pressing, stretching, turning, and repeating creates an unexpected parallel with training. Both require patience. Both depend on repetition. Both transform raw material through controlled movement. For Lee, the pizza shop therefore becomes more than a backdrop for his relationship with Mia and Victor. It becomes another place where he learns that mastery rarely comes from one dramatic moment. It comes from doing something again and again until the body understands what the mind once had to think about. The contrast between lanterns and subway grates reinforces the same cultural divide. Lanterns evoke tradition, warmth, and inherited history. Subway grates belong to the machinery of modern urban life. One suggests an old world built around continuity, the other suggests a city that never stops moving. Lee exists between those images. He is trying to preserve one while learning how to navigate the other. Rooftops offer another important spatial metaphor. Throughout the film, training above the crowded streets creates physical distance from the chaos below. The city remains visible, but from a higher perspective it becomes something that can be observed rather than simply endured. That makes the rooftop more than a convenient training location. It represents freedom. On the streets, Lee is surrounded by expectations, strangers, traffic, school pressure, family concerns, and the conflicts developing around him. Above the streets, there is room to breathe. The horizon opens. Movement becomes possible. Training becomes a conversation between the body and the space around it. The elevated perspective also mirrors Lee's emotional development. He gradually learns to step outside the immediate pressure of a situation and see it differently. Instead of reacting to every problem as if it is the end of the world, he begins recognizing that emotions can be observed, controlled, and redirected. Then there are the photographs of Bo. These images carry a completely different kind of visual weight because photographs freeze time. While Lee's body is constantly moving, Bo's image remains still. That contrast becomes a powerful representation of grief. Lee is alive in the present, but part of his emotional world has been fixed around a moment he cannot change. Early in the story, photographs of Bo feel almost like emotional anchors. They remind Lee of what has been lost and reinforce the guilt he carries. The past is always visually present even when no one speaks about it. As Lee progresses, the meaning of those images begins to change. He does not stop loving or remembering his brother. What changes is the relationship between memory and identity. Bo's photograph gradually becomes less like an accusation and more like a reminder of where Lee came from. That shift is crucial. The film's visual symbols repeatedly return to the same idea. Identity is not built by choosing between opposites. Warm and cool. Tradition and modernity. Stillness and movement. Memory and the present. Lee learns to exist between them. By the time the different visual worlds converge around the tournament, the imagery has prepared us for the emotional resolution. The film has spent its entire journey showing two worlds that appear incompatible slowly finding common ground. Just like Lee himself. He does not have to choose one branch and cut away the other. He simply has to learn how to grow in both directions, beneath its tournament structure and legacy characters. Karate Kid, Legends is quietly asking what strength means to a generation growing up in a world where conflict is no longer limited to physical spaces. The traditional martial arts bully can still exist, but modern intimidation has expanded. Reputation can be damaged publicly. Social isolation can spread instantly. Economic pressure can threaten an entire family. The film's antagonists therefore operate in a world where power is not measured only by who can throw the hardest punch. That makes its anti-bullying message more contemporary than the familiar underdog formula suggests. Lee is not simply dealing with someone who insults him in a school hallway. The pressure around him reaches into his friendships, his family, and the stability of the people who have welcomed him. Victor's pizza shop becomes vulnerable because someone with greater power believes that intimidation can force weaker people to surrender. In that sense, bullying becomes structural. It is about controlling someone's choices until resistance feels impossible. Lee's response offers a different model of strength. He does not win by becoming more intimidating than the people threatening him. He learns to resist without becoming a mirror of them. That distinction is especially relevant in an era where aggression can be rewarded with attention, status, and viral visibility. The film's martial arts philosophy pushes against that idea. Training is supposed to make a person more disciplined, not more performative. The strongest fighter is not necessarily the person who looks most dangerous. Real mastery requires the ability to control the impulse to prove yourself every second. That idea becomes increasingly important in a culture where competition can easily turn into spectacle. The mentorship structure reflects the same evolution. Traditional martial arts stories often present the master as an unquestionable authority. The student obeys, the teacher provides wisdom, and the hierarchy remains clear. Legends complicates that structure through Han and Daniel. Their relationship with Lee is not simply about issuing commands. Each teacher brings knowledge that the other does not possess, and Lee becomes an active participant in combining those lessons. That makes mentorship collaborative rather than purely hierarchical. The student is not valuable because he perfectly imitates his master. He becomes valuable when he understands the principles deeply enough to adapt them. Lee's hybrid approach therefore represents a more modern idea of education. Learn from the people who came before you, but do not confuse respect for tradition with the obligation to remain unchanged. The philosophical foundation beneath that idea can also be read through the concept of balance. Kung Fu's association with Chinese philosophical traditions naturally invites comparisons with Taoist ideas of complementary forces. Strength and softness, movement and stillness, resistance and adaptation do not necessarily cancel each other out. They can work together. Lee's training embodies that principle because his success depends on knowing when to yield and when to respond. Miyagi-Do adds another dimension through its emphasis on patience and emotional control. There is a stoic quality to the idea that strength begins with controlling your response to circumstances you cannot control. Lee cannot undo Bo's death. He cannot control Connor's behavior. He cannot erase his mother's fear. But he can control what he does next. That is where the two philosophies converge. Neither teaches Lee that life will stop hurting. They teach him that pain does not have to determine his character. And that leads directly to the meaning of the word legend. A legend is usually imagined as someone who achieved extraordinary things. But the film quietly challenges that definition. Being a legend is not simply inheriting a famous name, defeating a champion, or standing beside characters from previous generations. It is carrying something forward without becoming trapped by it. Daniel carries Miyagi's legacy. Han carries his own history of loss and responsibility. Lee inherits both, but he cannot simply become another Daniel or another Han. His responsibility is to transform what they gave him into something that belongs to his own generation. That is the real burden of legacy. The past gives you a foundation, but it also gives you expectations. Once people call someone a legend, every future decision is measured against what came before. The danger is becoming so focused on preserving the legacy that there is no room left for growth.